It's time to finish setting up the big DeWalt GE radial arm saw. The first thing I had to do was clean out that corner of the shop. It had become a dumping ground for all the scrap wood that was being produced by all the projects I'd been doing. I decided I'd keep the smaller radial arm saw and use it as a dado cutting saw. So I would set up the two saws next to each other with one table and one fence. So I moved them around and I unhooked the feeble attempt at dust collection that I had. And I moved the two saws around trying to get them in a location where one fence would work for both of them. I wanted to do dust collection, and I've seen a method where the ducts for the dust collection come up from below and then work through the fence of the saw. So I thought I would try and make the ductwork that would work under the table. I've got 6-inch dust collection pipes, and it's hard and expensive to find that size fitting. You find fitting and pipes up to 4 inches just fine. That's what everyone sells. But once you step above that size, it sort of moves into a different realm. So for the price of one 6-inch Y connection, I can buy a nice piece of plywood and just make my own ductwork. So I started by cutting out the sides of the shape that I wanted to make. And I had laid it out as one big piece, and it was going to be just too big to cut out of one sheet of plywood, or it was going to use up the entire sheet. So I cut it into smaller pieces that I then had to reattach once the pieces were cut out. And this seemed like the perfect place for pocket screws, mostly just because it would be quick and I wouldn't have to wait for glue to dry. Now, they weren't real strong at first when the pieces were just their own piece, but once I started to put the section together, it gained a lot of strength. So I made a giant F. Now, to make it into a box section that would actually carry air, I needed a flexible side as well. So I have this really thin piece of plywood, and the way I have it standing here, the grain on the outside layers runs up and down. I was wondering about whether this would be true, but it seems to be this way. It's a little bendier than trying to bend it this way, like vertically. So I want to cut my strips so I can wrap them around the curves of the ductwork. So I think I want to cut the strips this way so that I'm cutting across the grain on the outer layers of the plywood, if that makes sense. So I cut those strips. I did it at first without a hold down, and because it's so bendable, that was kind of difficult. So I clamped a feather board to the fence that would help hold the piece down on the table. Now, to put this together, I made a series of blocks that would be the right width or the right length to make the width that I needed. And I clamped my two side pieces to those blocks. So I was sort of making a big sandwich. And that would hold the curved side pieces in the right place. Then I could attach the flexible pieces to that. I just used glue and staples. Finished nails wouldn't really work that well because they would tend to come out. So the staples seem to be working better with the crown to sort of hold the piece in place. It went pretty well, and it became much more rigid once it was put together into a box section. And once I did the inside curves, I could do the outside. So I had to flip everything over. And I almost forgot to take out the blocking pieces that I had in there. That would have been really bad because that would have blocked the airflow almost completely and made the whole thing pointless. While I was making this, I was thinking I would bring it in from behind the saws and bring it in at an angle up to the underside of the table. And this would help with the airflow, and it seemed like it would make it easier to install. But once I was trying to get it to fit and wondering how I was going to hold it at that angle and how I was going to cut and work out the angle on the ends as it intersected with the table, it started to make more sense to just have the ductwork vertical and just sitting below the table, so it would run between the legs of the saws. So I had to thread it under the tables, which wasn't too bad on the big saw. I just kind of brought it in from below. But then the littler saw, I had to lean up and then carefully get the ductwork underneath the legs. But it did work in the end. So that's what the ductwork looks like and how it'll sit under the saws. I had to make a transition between the piece I just made and the dust collection pipe that runs along the wall. So I had to make a little S-curve to make up that difference between the center of the legs of the saws and the wall of the shop. So it's the same method with a 1/2-inch piece of plywood cut to make the shape, and then a 1/16 or an 1/8 inch piece of plywood to make the curve. I flattened up the end, and I realized I needed to make some kind of way to connect the two pieces, as well as a connection to the pipe of the dust collection. So I made flanges for the wooden dust collection parts. So between the two wooden parts, I made a square shape, and I made a round hole for the pipe that comes in at the wall. So for the connection between the two wooden pieces, I lined up the inside and I screwed them together, and then I cut the outside flush. Then I could take those apart and attach them to the ends that we're going to connect. So when I put it back together again and I line up the outside, it'll make the inside lined up. So it's basically the same thing you'd see on a big pipe that's got a flange on it with a bunch of bolts holding it together. Now to do the table. And the table will be made from two pieces. There'll be a upper piece and a lower piece. And the lower piece will connect to the legs and kind of give a flat surface to then mount the top sort of finished surface to. And it'll just give it more thickness and make it more rigid. So I did a drawing, a very careful drawing, that measured out what holes I needed to cut in the table. And I needed a cutout for the vertical column of the saws, and I needed 2 holes for the dust collection to come through the table. So once I cut that, I could slide it into place. I did go back and reshape the holes for the dust collection just a little bit, so they fit just a little better. Once I had it in place, I saw that it was a little bit deeper than I really needed as far as how far the saws would reach. So I could cut off the front 4 inches. And then to this first piece of the table, I could attach the dust collection ductwork. So I screwed that in place. And I put some old caulk around the seam, which was messy, but it worked. Now I thought I would make the front a little more rigid by attaching some struts to the underside of this sub-table. But after putting a few in place, it didn't really seem like they were doing much, so I took them out. I decided the 2 layers of the table would work just fine. So the top section, or the finished table, had similar cutouts, but I wanted to have more surface than the sub-table had. And this table was up high enough where it could go over some of the base to the saw, but I needed to pocket out a little bit of the back. So this is where I cut out on one side, and then I had to flip the piece over and cut out the other side. I guess at one point I was thinking about carving into the top of the table, which is why I did the cutouts on that side. Looking at it now, I could have done everything from one side, and that would have made it a little bit easier. I got it all in place, and I hadn't seen, there's a little wire coming out of the box at the back of the saw that needed a little cutout, and it was easier just to cut that by hand than to carry the whole thing back over to the machine and draw and figure out and set up. And this was about 50 times faster to do it this way. But it seemed like it was working the way it was supposed to. Now to start working on the fence. So the fence is going to have the dust collection air moving through it. So my thought was to build it up out of a series of pieces of plywood and then cut those vents into each piece. So when they get stacked up, there's a bunch of holes running through the fence. So I'm cutting out those vents. I ended up sort of doing the finish cut first, and then cutting out the center with a bigger bit that was a little rougher, so I'd get a cleaner cut on the plywood. And I still had to go back and sand a little bit. The sides were a little fuzzy. I don't know if that's just my bit is getting dull or I'm not going in the right direction, but it was pretty easy to clean up. So the fence will kind of go like this behind the blade. And the side with the dado saw didn't need to be as tall, because that saw is just not as big. So I glued all of the strips of plywood together. Once I had the fence in place and I could kind of see how it was going to work, it looked like the front edge to the dust collection hole would work better if it was kind of honed down a little bit and made a little rounder to the airflow. So I took a rasp and just kind of rounded over that corner. And I cut the line that the saw was going to make. Now this can be adjusted as far as the angle is on the saw, but I figured I would get the fence as close to square to that as I could, just to start. So to put the fence down, I drilled holes through it, and I'd figured out where those would go based on where the blade is and where the vents are and how that would sort of work best. And I could bring the fence into place and then just screw it into place. One thing to remember is that when you run the saw through the fence, it makes a break in that continuous piece. You have to lay the screws out so it will hold both sides as though they're two separate pieces, because they are two separate pieces once the saw goes through it. Now I need to make the piece that'll connect the hole in the table with the fence. So it'll sort of be a cover, or it'll be sides and a top. And one thing I didn't think about and kind of put it off, but now I'm having to figure it out, is I didn't put blast gates into my ductwork. So if I want to have one saw's dust collection on and one saw's off, I have to be able to close off that hole. So this cover piece I'm making, I'm going to make so it's removable, and I'll have a piece of wood in that hole in the table so that I can have one saw with dust collection and one saw without dust collection, or both saws with dust collection going. And then in the line running to the saws, I have a blast gate, so the whole setup can be turned off. So in my sides to my cover, I made the bottom piece have some parts that sort of stick out and go over some threaded bolts in the table. And I then need to make some knobs to hold down that cover piece. So I cut out some knobs and put in some threaded inserts. So that bottom piece can be held in place with those knobs. That seems to work. Now the upper sections of the sides I can sand flush. And I can glue that bottom piece with the tabs on it onto the upper section. And with this, I have to be careful where I put the nails, so I'm not putting them where the blade's going to go. Then the last thing is a top, sort of the cover. And that piece I wanted to attach with screws so it could be removed if I wanted to change the shape of the cut that the saw makes, or if this gets messed up at some point. I wasn't sure how well this was really going to work. So I made the cut for the saw. And since the blade's coming up through the piece of wood, I put a piece of tape down just to try and stop it from tearing out too badly. It actually worked pretty well. So then I started testing pieces of wood, and it actually works really well for the dust collection. There's a tiny amount of dust getting out. It maybe 5 or 3% of what's being made, but it actually works really well. And the dust collection in the fence actually holds the workpiece to the fence, which is kind of neat too. So I cut the same setup for the dado saw, and this makes a little more dust, but the blade is also making a lot more dust doing this too. It's making 5 or 10 times more dust than the regular saw is making. So I don't know, on this one maybe doing the hose from the blade cover around to the dust collection would help. I'll have to play around with that. But for now it's actually working really well. This design with the dust collection in the fence isn't wholly mine. I actually found videos about doing it this way, and it seemed like a nice way to do it. So I'll put some links to that in the description below. But it's a nice way to do it because the dust collection isn't in the way, and the dust just kind of disappears. It's like, where does the dust go? Thanks for watching.